So last week I talked about talking about the rosary, but I think there's something else adjacent to the rosary, which is one of the reasons why we don't pray it as well as we could. So if you can see in this painting, this is by Hieronymus Bosch. It's on the 7 deadly sins. In this one, this religious sister has come and is offering to pray the rosary, and as you can see, the guy she's offering it to, he's kicked back before the fire, and he's just relaxing in his robe. He's got a closed book next to him. He's got, it looks like, a rosary in his hand, and he's asleep with a giant pillow behind him on his medieval recliner. This is, I think, the oldest lazy boy you can find. And so you can probably guess where we're going in terms of what vice we need to talk about. But I would just say, to begin, maybe do a little bit of a quick self-inventory. So think about the last 2 months. Have you found yourself more disorganized? Have you found yourself less productive? Have you found yourself more listless, maybe physically, mentally? Have you found yourself more short-tempered? And have you found yourself feeling further from God? So maybe some of those apply to you, maybe none of them do. But I would just say, if you find yourself saying yes to those, you may be struggling from what's called, it's sometimes pronounced asadia, sometimes pronounced achadia, or sloth. We'll just say sloth for the sake of clarity. Now, sloth is, I think, a misunderstood sin. We have this idea that sloth is just laziness. It's just, say, I'm sitting in front of the fire, kicked back. But it's a little bit more difficult than that. So the Catechism describes it in the glossary in the back as a culpable lack of physical or spiritual effort. Culpable lack of physical or spiritual effort. And says, asadia or spiritual sloth goes so far as to refuse the joy that comes from God and to be repelled by divine goodness. So my note on that is that this lack of effort, it might take the form of inaction. It might take the form of falling asleep in front of the fire instead of praying the rosary like you're supposed to. But it might also take the form of mental or physical busyness. And we'll look into that in a second. So St. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa talks about it as an oppressive sorrow, which so weighs upon man's mind that he wants to do nothing. A sort of sluggishness of the mind which neglects to begin good. So the presence of the rosary there, Bosch is doing that for a reason. He's saying, like, look, this is the good the guy's being invited to, and he doesn't want to do it. Like, it's his point is not it's a sin to take a nap. That's not it at all. It's rather, if you're supposed to be praying the rosary and then you decide to go take a nap instead, then you've neglected to do some good God has invited you to. Then you might be looking at something like a willful neglect. And that's when you start talking about something sinful, something where there's culpability attacked. But it has to be like you're called to be doing some good that you failed to do. In legal terms, think about like the sin of negligence. There's something you should have been doing or shouldn't have been doing, and you just failed to do the right thing in that situation. Maybe you didn't do something, terribly wicked, like an act of commission, but you had a culpable act of omission. That's the idea behind sloth. So concretely, it looks like this. There's some particular good each of us is called to be doing today. Probably there are several particular goods each of us are called to be doing today. And there's 3 different ways sloth can manifest itself in terms of how we respond to that good. The first one is just avoiding the good. And so spiritual writers like St. Isidore, St. Gregory, and then St. Thomas Aquinas will talk about the daughters of sloth, meaning like what are the fruits of sloth in a negative way. And so the kind of daughters of sloth we can hear about here would be things like drowsiness, idleness, sluggishness, faint-heartedness, and even despair. Now, faint-heartedness is kind of a shirking from the things of holiness. Sluggishness, you kind of do the things, but you're really half-hearted with it. And then despair, ultimately, you just kind of say, this is too hard. Like, the Christian life's too difficult. I give up. That's what despair looks like. So that's the part of sloth that I think we know the best. We usually talk about it with just idleness, but obviously already we see it's much bigger than that. That despair can be a symptom of sloth. But it can also take the form of struggling against the good. So maybe rather than praying the rosary half-hearted or falling asleep or just refusing to do it, maybe you lash out. Maybe this would be the sin of spite. Now, spite is against those who lead us to the good. So if the guy in the Hieronymus Bosch painting got really angry with the religious sister for suggesting they pray the rosary, that's one of the manifestations of spite. When you feel embittered towards your wife or your kids for making demands on your time because you want them to just relax, that's spite. And then malice is a little different. It's related, but malice is when you are upset with the good itself. That's when you start to have a hatred of holiness in a strict sense. But you're not mad at the people, you're mad at the good. So that's the distinction. Hopefully that makes sense. But then the third way is distracting ourselves. So this leads to what's called mental unease. Your mind is just not at rest. A sin called curiosity or curiositas, that doesn't mean just like a natural curiosity. It's like when you're supposed to clean your living room, say, and you get to the bookshelf and you just pull some random book off the shelf and start reading it. That's more like curiosity. Like it's a curiosity that's taking you away from the things you're actually called to do. Loquacity, which is excessive talkativeness, bodily restlessness, and instability. So you'll notice all of those have in common, you're fidgety, right? Like you're mentally fidgety, you're physically fidgety, you're jabbering on, or you're off exploring something that you're not even supposed to be working on right now. All of those things, you can kind of see, hopefully, kind of a picture that forms. I'm almost imagining like, a suspect being brought in for questioning. You get the nerves going. What does that look like? You're tapping your feet. You're giving these really excessively long answers, and so on and so forth. So all of those are symptoms of what this can kind of look like. Thoughts, questions, comments about that so far?
Yeah, this is scary. There's always, it feels to me like almost every day there's a task that I recognize as a big task. It's got several steps. And staying on that task and getting it done is very difficult. When I look at the past 2 or 3 slides you've got here, I mean, I can read myself in every one of them. And I think of big things going on. I mean, they're tasks that are going to take weeks. And if I don't stay on task, it's never going to get done. And other things happen.
Yeah.
And it's a trap. I don't know if trap, that's the wrong word, but it feels very, very difficult. So like I said, it's scary.
Yeah, I'm glad you said it, because I think you're right. I think it hopefully you can look at this and say, oh, okay, I see myself on this chart, maybe here or here, here, and here, or this particular point. Some of these you might struggle with more than others. It's going to look different for different people. So it is this question. And I plan to actually give you an answer to this, Gary, that what do we do when we have a big task before us? Because it's really overwhelming, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we'll talk a little bit about what's called micro progress and a little bit about what's called the Pomodoro Technique, just to get into some, like, even some sort of secular efficiency things going on. But then we'll talk about it from a more distinctly spiritual perspective, the notion of plan of life. So that's kind of where we're going to go. And I think as we go through this time, I think you'll see an answer kind of emerge to that. But I think, yeah, you're in the right spot in terms of saying, uh-oh, this might be me. Now what? So yeah, sloth can look like this, but sloth can also look
Joe,
like,
let me ask a question.
yeah.
Can it also manifest itself? I think, what I know is a lot of times, you have many options before you of what to do. God throws a lot of things out in front of you. Can it also manifest itself when you pick the ones you want to do more than the ones that may be a little bit more difficult?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Because, right, there are plenty of things that you technically need to do. But if you find that you're avoiding the things that you're actually being called to do, and that can take a lot of different forms. So I was exposed to this in a radical way back years ago when I was living in Virginia, and a priest told me about a woman who was spending hours a day in adoration, which normally is great, right? You'd say, oh, that woman must be very holy. But she had a husband who was disabled at home, and he had to talk to her and say, you cannot be spending all your time at church when your husband needs you to take care of him. She had the good she wanted to do for God. God had a different good he wanted her to be doing. And so it can be a form of sloth to say, well, here's what I want to do for you, God, instead. That's a hard thing, that doesn't look so much like the lazy boy, right? That looks like something a little more pernicious, a little easier for us to slip into without really intending to. Now, thanks be to God. Like, we're talking here about doing this culpably. So if God puts before you 5 different things and you choose one, don't be spending your day second guessing, saying, oh, why did I choose that one? Did I enjoy it too much? Like, that's a negative road to go down spiritually. But if you find that you are taking the easy or most likable option every time, and maybe you're being nudged or pulled to do something a little more difficult, something a little more outside of your comfort zone, then you have to listen to that. And if you don't listen to that, then you're in trouble. That's more like the area of sloth at that point. So yeah, I would say these are 2 of the faces of sloth that we're seeing before us. But as you just heard, like, they're not the only ones. It can take this form of short-temperedness. It can take, I think a lot of people are feeling more on edge now. And some of that is because the normal routines and patterns have broken down. And there's a sense of loss of control. There's a sense of being overwhelmed. There's a sense of having nothing to do. And all of those things can kind of lead to these other things that they don't look like sloth, but they can be, like spite and malice. Like, when you see spite and malice, you don't think, oh, I bet that's because of sloth. But Aquinas' point is, it sure can be. It sure can be. In the same way that I might get snappy at a coworker if they, have a big assignment that they pull out at 4:45 and I'm wanting to get home, or whatever. The same thing kind of happens spiritually. Okay. So next question, maybe you already see the answer to this, is why is sloth sinful? Because on the surface it feels like no big deal. Particularly if there's nothing that you're strictly required to do. Why would it be sinful to take it easy or to give your day to idleness and amusement? It seems like, well, aren't we called to rest? Aren't we called to leisure? We've talked many times about the importance and value of leisure. And so on the surface, it seems like sloth wouldn't be sinful at all. It'd be, good. Well, Aquinas has an answer to this. One passage he points out is from Sirach, chapter 6, and it's describing wisdom. And it's a beautiful little passage. Listen, my son, and accept my judgment. Do not reject my counsel. Put your feet into her fetters and your neck into her collar. Put your shoulder under her and carry her, and do not fret under her bonds. Come to her with all your soul and keep her ways with all your might. So it's this idea of taking on wisdom, and really we can say taking on the will of God as a yoke. And putting your whole body and your whole soul into it. And so he's going to say, sloth is a rejection of this. You're not approaching the will of God. You're not putting your shoulder into it. You might technically be doing the bare minimum, but you're not body and soul giving yourself to God and to his will. But he says, if you want a commandment, he says it actually goes against the commandment about hallowing the Sabbath day. He says, for it implicitly commands the mind to rest in God. And sorrow of the mind about the divine good is contrary to that. So it's not that sloth and the Sabbath are the same thing. They're actually opposites. Because with the Sabbath, you're resting with God. And with sloth, you're taking a rest from God. It's a rejection of the divine good God's calling you to. It's a rejection of his invitation, of his will, which means in a real way it's a rejection of him. So yeah, notice that it's actually opposed to the kind of holy leisure and rest that we're called to by God. Like, there is nothing wrong with enjoying a nice fire, kicking back, relaxing in your chair at the end of the day. And in fact, sitting there praying the rosary with your family can be a beautiful experience for your family and for your faith life. And, you know, that can be profound. Or that can be what sin looks like, because you're supposed to be doing some good and you know it and you're not doing it. Simple enough, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with golfing, but if a person is drowning in the water and you decide to keep your golf game going, a court would probably find you criminally responsible. You know, like, it's not that the thing itself is bad, it's that you're called to be doing something else right now. So please don't take this as relaxing is always bad. It's more, don't let that become an idol. Don't let that become a thing that keeps you from the will of God. And Exodus 34 shows this. But it says, 6 days you shall work, but on the seventh day you shall rest, and plowing time and in harvest time you shall rest. Now notice that the Sabbath was actually given because otherwise farmers were just working their butts off during the harvest, during plowing time. So one of the pretty explicit reasons we get it is to force us to build in some time to relax and to rest and to just be with God in a more intentional way. But notice also this connection between the days of work and the days of rest. That the Sabbath is not a repudiation of work, but it goes along with it. Okay. Thoughts about this? Anything anybody wants to add right here? Okay, well, jump in if you need. But I'd just say this: like, you were made for more than this. Think about the ways that we spend what we call leisure, what we call relaxing, and a lot of it's not actually relaxing. Like, that guy, he's not really relaxed, right? He's not really in any kind of leisure. He's just mentally kind of dead. So here's the idea: like, you were made for the glory of God. And so Sirach is saying, give yourself totally to that body and soul. And when you don't do that, there's almost a form of death associated with that. Like, you are turning your back on what it is to live. You're turning your back on the life to which you've been called, to embrace something that's more like a catatonic state, where you're just kind of, you know, even we use terms like vegging out. This idea that all of your higher mental activities kind of stop, and it becomes almost vegetative. That's the idea of vegging out. And I would just say you're made for more than that. Again, it's not bad to watch TV. It's not bad to relax. But if that's what your day is being built around, I'll bet God has a better plan for your life. And you probably just need to talk to him about it. The final reason sloth is sinful is that it's a prayer killer. So the Catechism talks about this. There's a form of what they call depression. They mean like kind of the spiritual oppression of the emotion of the mind and everything else due to lax ascetical practice. In other words, if you're slacking off in your prayer, if you have decreased vigilance, if you have carelessness of heart, you're going to find a situation in which the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. You've weakened your flesh by not doing what you should do. And it says, you know, the greater the height, the harder the fall. Painful as discouragement is, it's the reverse of presumption. In presumption, you feel like you're pretty much on the right track, and you get a little lax because you feel like you're doing such a great job. Well, then as you get lax, suddenly you realize, like, oh, this is really hard. I can't pray very well anymore. And so if we find ourselves in that spot, if I'm watching an 8-hour TV marathon and then I sit down to try to pray, it's going to be hard, right? I'm not going to immediately go into a place of meditative prayer. I'm going to have made my job harder by kind of numbing the mind, dulling the mind, and having this carelessness of heart. So the Catechism says basically, if you find yourself in that spot, don't be worried about it. Just trust more and hold fast in constancy. So do better next time. Don't freak out. Like, it isn't like God's abandoned you. It's more like you've abandoned God in a certain way with this kind of carelessness. And then you've got to kind of repair that. So to Gary's question, then, what is the cure? I'd say this, like, this is a question that there's a lot we can actually learn from non-Christians or non-religious writers, I should say, as well, because there's a secular version of this, right? Like, sloth, it's a spiritual problem, but it's a spiritual problem that even non-spiritual people notice. Like, everybody has felt the kind of things that we're talking about when we're talking about sloth. And so you'll find things like efficiency experts who talk about this. So the first one, I don't have a slide for this, but I wanted to mention the idea of what's called micro progress. And because Gary talked about these big things that seem overwhelming. In both the spiritual life and more broadly, when you're facing a good that seems too big, it's often really helpful to break it down into its constitutive parts. So if you've got to write a report for work, and maybe it's a 20-page thing, and you've got to do research for it, and you've got to have like slides and graphs and all of that, and you just say, that's too much. When am I going to do that? It's overwhelming. I don't think I'm a good writer, etc. What you would do is you would divide up the tasks and say, here are all of the things that have to go into it. Like, if you were going to make a souffle, you'd want a recipe that goes step by step by step by step, almost to an obnoxious degree. But you break down each step of what has to happen for this report or whatever project or whatever. And then you just don't worry about trying to tackle everything, just tackle the next thing on the list. And when you're done, cross it off. That crossing it off part seems irrelevant, but it's actually not, because psychologically, what you're doing is you're stimulating this kind of, the dopamine and everything else. You've got a little bit of a victory. At the start of the year, being told, like, oh, you got to go win the Super Bowl, that's too big. Okay, well, you got to do well at this practice. You've got to, you've got to run this. You got to and break it down into manageable kind of bite-sized chunks. Eat those chunks, so to speak, and then cross it off your list. So then maybe by mid-afternoon, you're looking at your list and saying, wow, I actually got 17 of these steps done. They were small, but I've only got however many left, or hopefully don't even look at how many you've got left. Just say, I got another one to do. I got another one to do. That's the way I think you can approach it. That's called micro progress. I mentioned this is relevant in a particular way for the spiritual life. When you're struggling with a variety of sins, good spiritual writers will tell you to look for what's called your principal vice. Meaning, and we'll probably talk about this, we'll probably do a whole session on micro progress and principal vice and all this. But the basic idea is, what is the number one area that I'm falling? What is the number one, what is the chief sin that I'm struggling with in my life? And I'm not going to focus on every spiritual battle that I have. I'm going to focus on this one in a particular way. That doesn't mean I give myself permission to, commit the other 6 deadly sins. But it does mean that, my chief focus is how am I chiefly falling, right? Like, what's the root sin? And I'm just going to spend all day attacking at that root. And so, St. Ignatius of Loyola would say, do even 2 examinations of conscience, one midday and one in the evening, just focused on that one sin. Where was I successful? Where did I fail? And then go to God in gratitude or go to God in contrition. You see what I mean? Like, it's hyper focused, but it's specific and it's manageable. Or maybe you're only battling your short temper. Maybe you're only battling sloth. Maybe you're only battling lust all day. And then you take every action you need to kind of win that fight. And at the end of the day, you've made a little baby step. And you can build on that. That's micro progress. I got a good comment. One of the guys said sloth appears to be the gateway to other sins. And the answer is yes. Like, a lot of sins are caused by that. So there's a famous scene, David and Bathsheba. Remember how the chapter begins? At the time when kings are out on campaign, where's David? He's at home, sitting on his roof, and it's there that he sees a naked woman next door. He shouldn't have been at home laying about the house in the middle of the day. He had a job to do, and he didn't do it. So for him, the root sin was actually sloth. He'd sent his commanders to go do the fighting for him rather than actually leading his men. And that sloth, while he's sitting around in the afternoon by himself, it's the modern or the ancient version of internet pornography, right? You happen to see the naked woman next door. I think if you really dig down, the root cause of sin, it may not be lust, even in cases like pornography. The root cause of the sin may actually be something like sloth. It may actually be you were supposed to be asleep, or you were supposed to be doing this thing of God, or you were supposed to be somewhere and you weren't there, and you were browsing the internet when you shouldn't have been on the internet at all because you should have been somewhere else. That's the idea. Okay, so the first cure, micro progress. The second cure, or second part of the cure, if you will, is, we'll talk, I say plan of life there, but this is really a Pomodoro technique. This is Francesco Cirillo. He's an efficiency expert, and his technique, so the reason it's called Pomodoro, by the way, is old like timers. Pomodoro is just Italian for tomato. So it's an old tomato timer. And so he would use a timer like this when he had a big task. And he would do these steps, and this works very well. So the first thing is you decide on the task to be done. Maybe that task is given to you. Maybe you're just kind of looking over your day or your week or your month and saying, what are the things I need to do? What should I be working on today? Now notice you're intentional about that in step one. A lot of times we hurt ourselves by not being intentional about the things that we're working on. So for instance, notice which times of the day you have the most energy. Notice the times of the day that you have the least energy. For a lot of guys, the time right after lunch is a low energy time of day. That's a good time to check email. On the other hand, right in the beginning of the day, when you've got a lot of vim and excitement for the day and energy, you go through a bunch of really dull, tedious kind of stuff, you can kill that energy and really hurt your own efficiency. So the first thing is you really just say, what should I be doing right now? And how long do I think that's going to take to do? Or maybe it's too big to do in one chunk. So I just say, how long can I realistically work on that without going crazy? Then you set a timer. Then you work on the task and you don't get distracted. So if you say, I'm going to work on this for the next 25 minutes, that's the unit he usually used. Maybe I think of 12 other things I could be doing, but I say, well, maybe I'll do them in the next block of time. But for this block of time, for the next 25 minutes, I'm only working on this. And then you only work on that. And then when the timer rings, you take a break. That can be a short break, like a 3 to 5 minute break. If you're still in the middle, like you just need like a little get up and stretch, maybe get a cup of water, reset the timer, get back to it. Or maybe you're totally done with the task, take a longer break, maybe 15 to 30 minutes, and then start on a new task. This way of kind of getting through it helps avoid two things. Number one, there are ways that we get really bogged down in things that have become fruitless. Like there are times where you might spend 2 hours on a thing because you didn't take a break. And so you're mentally tapped out. And what you needed to do was stop, reset, get a cup of water, exercise, do something else, just take that break and then get back to it. And you would have been done with it had you just done that. But instead we force ourselves to kind of keep going, and it actually hurts us on the level of efficiency. Or we'll go to the other extreme. It's, well, I've got to work on this all day, and so it wouldn't kill me to just have this one little diversion and this one little diversion and this one little diversion. And then at the end of the day, we're like, oh, I really didn't get very much done on that. I worked on it for 8 hours. It's like, no, you didn't. You thought you were working on it for 8 hours, but 5 hours you were distracting yourself, and you were overwhelmed the whole time. And so you just felt, we break it down again. Notice this really also is another form of micro progress. You've broken it down into these bite-sized chunks of 25 minutes. You can't work uninterrupted on a thing for 8 hours, probably. You can for 25 minutes, probably. So it's knowing your own limitations, attention span, physically, whatever it may be. That's the Pomodoro Technique. I think that's a really helpful method. You can do some modified version of that if need be. But St. Josemaria Escrivá talks about what's called a plan of life. And a plan of life, it uses some of the things we're talking about, but it's a little more broad. It just means that we are looking at the entire day and really the entire week and month and our whole life and saying, okay, what are the things I'm working on? What are my short, medium, long-term goals? And when am I going to do them? How much time am I going to give them? All of those questions, like having kind of a master plan for your day. This is a long quote, but I think he's got some really great stuff to say. So I want to kind of read you this and then see what your thoughts are. He says, when we examine how our piety is and what it should be like, that is, what specific points of our personal relationship with God need improving, if you've understood me right, you'll reject the temptation of imagining fantastic feats, because you will have discovered that our Lord is quite happy if we offer him little tokens of love any moment of the day. This is micro progress in the spiritual life, right? Like, if you think that the solution to your problems with like all of the ways that you're coming short is that you have to do something amazing and heroic and, this great, huge thing, that's probably wrong. That's probably actually a temptation. And the nature of the temptation, like if the devil can get you thinking you have to do this amazing thing for God that you're just spiritually not capable of doing, then what do? You wave the white flag, you give up, and you don't make the actual progress you could have made. So instead, Josemaria says, no, the little tokens of love throughout the day. Offer him that. That'll be pleasing to him. And don't worry if you can't give him anything bigger right now. He says, try to commit yourself to a plan of life and keep to it. And he gives you some parts to it. A few minutes of mental prayer, Holy Mass, daily if you can manage it, and frequent communion. Now, obviously, we put an asterisk next to that if you're able to receive right now. Regular recourse to the Holy Sacrament of Forgiveness, even though your conscience doesn't accuse you of mortal sin. Visiting Jesus in the tabernacle, praying and contemplating the mysteries of the Holy Rosary, and so many other marvelous devotions you know or can learn. Okay. That's a pretty good recipe in a day, right? Oh, was somebody going to add something?
Joe?
Yep.
Yeah, this is Scott. I would say on your previous slide, what struck me is it's not in there, but it's really implied by your sloth, is undivided attention along with love. And that is that and that really goes into dealing with our families and everything else, is that we don't allow sloth to continue to creep in. And I know it does in my case. And so, it's not that we don't love things, it's just that we don't, especially with, God and all the blessings that we fail to count during the times we're in right now, we don't sit back and give undivided attention and love.
Yeah, there was a line on the old sitcom Parks and Rec one of the characters says, don't half-ass two things, full-ass one thing. And it's this idea, like, pardon the language there, but I think it's a very good spiritual point that, especially in the age of technology, I can be trying to check email and, keep an eye on something for work and be present with my family in the evening. And that's not what I'm supposed to do. So maybe it comes down to, okay, well, I need to periodically, maybe you've got some important thing where you just can't just totally turn off. But you can plan around that and say, I'm going to check every half hour. I'm going to check every hour, make sure nothing comes through, that sort of thing. But you're still able to then turn the rest of the time and give yourself completely to the moment, whatever that looks like. Yeah, we have to distinguish what's urgent, what's important. And so we have to figure out, like, where am I putting my time and where am I putting my attention? Because where we put our attention is ultimately where we put our love. Attentiveness and love go very much hand in hand. If you love someone, they're the object of your affection, but they're also the object of your attention. And so if we can't give our attention to our family, if we can't give our attention to God, there's a spiritual problem there, and there's a problem of a defect, even a defect in charity. This helps address that. This helps to approach that. Okay.
Hey, Joe, this is Greg.
Yeah, Greg.
One of the things I want to do, but I hardly ever do, is try to offer up everything I do to God throughout the day. And at the end of the day, I realized that I hardly even once did that. How does one accomplish that? Because I hear that's what the saints do or did. And how's that accomplished? Because I just don't get it.
Well, it's like the, how do you get to, what is that? What is that?
How do you get to Carnegie Hall?
Carnegie Hall. How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice.
Yeah.
Build the comedic timing on that. But yeah, the idea is the same. That if you find at the end of the day you're doing an examination of conscience and realizing you didn't offer these things up to God, well, I'd say two things. First, it's good that you're doing the examination of conscience and noticing this. And second, you can now offer that at the end of the day and say, God, a little late, but better late than never. Let me offer this to you. Maybe that's a good thing to have as a midday examine as well. You can have a little stopping point in the middle of the day. You could make a little alert on your phone or set a timer or something. In the middle of the day, you stop and you do a quick check just about that and just say, have I offered the things of my morning up to God? And if not, I'm going to do that now. And doing that will make you a little more mindful in the afternoon, where maybe it's too much to try to remember all day. And so now you just remember for half the day, right? And then, you use a timer or something to remind you partway through.
Basics, real basic, simple ideas. I like that.
Good.
Joe,
Yeah.
Joe, this is Tim. One of the things struggling with that particular point is that we often hear from our priests or people who give us advice spiritually, we were given God-given talents that hopefully we recognize and pursue. And if we're lucky enough to recognize and pursue them, every day, those things that I do naturally for my job, my family, my community, whatever they are, the talents that God gave me, those are easy things, at least from my point, to offer up, because I'm following what you gave me, I'm doing what you provided me as my talent, and I thank you for turning the good by focusing on that today.
Yeah, you're saying it's easier with those things like with work or something else?
Yeah, this is the talent you gave me. Thank you for giving me the talent. I'll focus on it today, do my best, and thank you.
Great, yeah, that's a good way to do it. I think that's good. And I like that you've mentioned kind of like, so we're seeing the first half of the recipe for daily life right here. A little bit of mental prayer, daily mass, frequent communion, regular confession, even if you're not in a state of mortal sin as far as you know. Visiting Jesus in the tabernacle. Now, obviously, right now, we're still waiting for that piece. praying and contemplating the rosary every day, and then other devotions you might have. Like spiritually, he's saying, make sure you get these bits if you want to do this really well. And depending on where you are, maybe you already have those bits, maybe you have some of them, maybe you have, maybe you're ready to add one more. But this is a good thing to strive for. But then he says, well, you shouldn't let these become rigid rules or watertight compartments. They should be flexible to help you in your journey, because you're living in the middle of the world with a life of hard professional work and social ties and obligations, which you should not neglect. Because in them, your conversation with God still continues. And I think this is Tim's point exactly, that you can still be having this conversation with God at the office, not just in the pew. So your plan of life ought to be like a rubber glove, which fits the hand perfectly. In other words, your plan of life should say realistically, who am I? What am I called to do today? And I don't just devise this like beautiful plan of what a monastic life might look like and then say, darn it, I blocked out 8 hours of prayer, but it turned out I had a job. You have a job. So build in, what you can, where you can. So I love this, that Opus Dei gets such a rap for being so rigid, but he's very explicitly like, don't be too rigid about this. Don't let this become water compartments. You might have a beautiful devotion you want to do, and then a family emergency comes up. Attend to that. Don't be crazy. You've got a life you're supposed to live, and bring God with you on that, as well as making intentional time. Oh, somebody else going to add something?
Yeah, I'm thinking back to a class from Mike Shierslick on virtues a number of years ago, and he talked about balance in what you're just saying there. And when we become so overly focused in one area, we neglect other areas of our lives, and this imbalance becomes sinful, really, when we pursue our work in detriment of our relationships, or pursue relationships in detriment to the work and responsibilities. I think the amazing invention of Sundays in creation gives us that balance for us to work and do all of our work in 6 days, work hard, be diligent with it, but then take time off to enjoy it. It gives us that balance there, so we're not getting so stressed on, well, I can't be slothful, can't be slothful, and never resting.
Yeah, because ironically, that is exactly what sloth is. It's not resting in God. Because it's a rejection of God's plan for your life. And God's plan for your life has rhythm and balance and leisure in it. Like what God wants you to do involves leisure. When we talk about doing what God wants us to do, I think the mistake we make is thinking that's going to just be a lot of unending work. It's going to just be a lot of tasks. And so we say, well, God, I can work for you for 8 hours, but then I really need to take a break and go home to my family. And it's like, no, he wants you to be with your family. He wants you to have leisure. He wants you to have rest. He wants you, like, he made the Sabbath, dummy. Like, that's, so we have this idea that doing God's will, doing the work of God, Opus Dei, that's what it means, the work of God. But that's going to just mean like never-ending toil. And that's totally wrong. Rather, the more we get into like the secular mindset, the more we reject God and go in this other direction, I think you find much more of a tendency to something like workaholism, right? Like just constantly working, never taking a break. And so even on Sunday, you're checking your phone constantly for work stuff. Even on Sunday, you're not really being able to fixate on God because you're focused on this, that, or the other thing.
And part of his purpose for Sundays is so that we can enjoy all that he's given us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But we do this by resting in God rather than resting from God. So in fact, Ed's point is a great segue into the next thing Josemaria says. He says, please don't forget that the important thing does not lie in doing many things. Limit yourself generously to those you can fulfill each day, whether or not you happen to feel like doing them. Pause right there. That sentence is huge. He's telling you to avoid two tendencies that we fall into. The first is to fill my day just with the things I want to do and avoid all of the unpleasant things I don't want to do but have to do. I don't feel like paying the power bill, or I don't feel like, doing this tedious bit of administrative work. I want to do this other thing, so I can fill the day just with my personal preferences. Don't do that. But the other thing not to do is to say, well, this huge, perfect day that I have in my mind, I have to live that. And then what happens? I get overwhelmed, I get frustrated, I get discouraged, and I make no progress in the spiritual life. It'd be like if you went to the gym and just said, okay, put 500 pounds on the barbell. I'm going to try this. You're not going to get very far, right? It's going to crush you. And he's saying, no, know your limits, know what you can realistically give generously, and plan to give that. Okay, it says these pious practices will lead you almost without you realizing it to contemplative prayer. Your soul will pour forth more acts of love, aspirations, acts of thanksgiving, acts of atonement, spiritual communions. This will happen while you go about your ordinary duties, while you answer the telephone, while you get on the bus, open and close the door, pass in front of the church, begin a new task, during the task, when you finish the task. You'll find yourself doing everything you do to your Father God. I think this answers the earlier question, how do we offer things up more to God? And part of that is plan the day well, have constant recourse to that plan, and you'll be attentive, I think, to the fact that you and God made a plan for the day, and you're on it together. Scott,
I think you're onto something there, Joe. What you just said there towards the end is that with God, you make a plan for the day.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in another personal development program right now, and a non-Catholic, Christian but non-Catholic. And one of the first things that he suggested we do is that we make an appointment with God. And for me, it's the first thing in the morning. Make an appointment with God and to review my life mission and goals, and then ask God's help for what are my priorities for the day.
Yeah.
And have my calendar with me, what are the things I'm supposed to be doing, and don't block, and then I've taken this in my thoughts, don't block out necessarily in the day I'm going to stop and I'm going to go pray this or I'm going to go do that. Be aware of God all day long, because we need a plan first thing in the morning.
Yeah.
So like you said, passing a church, say the sign of the cross as you pass a church. As you're getting ready to go into an important meeting, I try to remember, I don't do it all the time, but I try to remember to say, come Lord Jesus. And you try to have the Lord come with me, that we're there on purpose. And when I remember to do that, then I'm aware of Jesus, and it feels like I'm in that state that St. Paul talked about praying always.
Yeah, it really is a matter of both. We need to have times that are set aside just for God, but that doesn't mean the rest of the time is set aside from God. It doesn't mean the rest of the time we just leave God. There are times where we are very much deliberately with Him. And here, I think the analogy here is to marriage. There are times when you are just spending time with your wife, and if you want a healthy marriage, you need those times. But a lot of times, it's the two of you doing something, you're dealing with the kids, you're dealing with some problem, or you're, out doing something or whatever, and you're not doing the direct face-to-face. You need both, right? In our relationship with God is like that. We need these direct face-to-face times, and then we need these almost shoulder-to-shoulder times with God, right? Where we're tackling the day. Here's the thing He said to do. God be with me. St. Patrick's prayer of God before me, behind me, underneath me, within me, above me, that kind of notion. You can tackle the world with that.
I was just going to say St. Josemaria Escrivá just ruined my day. It was going to be all about me again. And so I think this is, you know, this is really good. This really hits me because there's things that I just really don't like to do and don't want to do. And you can get the list from my wife. It's like,
I've long thought if you had couples confessions, it could go a lot more in depth. But if you got to tell on each other. But no, so it's, I don't know what it says about you guys, but every week it seems like somebody's saying, you just ruined my week, you just ruined my day. So at least Josemaria gets the blame this time. So you keep coming back, which is good. All right, so to kind of summarize what he was saying, prayerfully discern each morning, or even better, the night before, what's going to happen that day. What do you need to do? Be generous, be balanced, but be realistic. I'd also say be specific. So don't just say, I'm going to pray today. Say something more like, I'm going to pray before breakfast for 20 minutes. But also, again, be flexible. So you can have the best laid plan and it can still go awry, right? Like you can plan out exactly what's going to happen and then something unexpected comes up. We all had this experience with the whole coronavirus thing. All of our plans were changed or modified kind of on the fly very quickly. That's how life is in big ways and in small. An Opus Dei priest gave this very nerdy example of the way electrical wires work, like power lines from electrical engineering. And what they do is they have certain posts. You know, they have the actual, the big power line poles, but then they run enough slack in between them. If you run too much slack, it's a problem. It's dangerous. You know, they'll hang too low, and people can get hurt or get shocked or whatever. But it's also not good to have them too taut. If you have them just like, you know, very tense, very taut, they're under too much pressure and they can snap. So both are, so you need to build in a little bit of slack. You need to build in a little bit of wiggle room, so to speak, for it to work. So I just say, figure out what are your posts. You know, for instance, maybe you've got like, okay, I've got man morning this morning from 6:45 to 8. Okay, boom, it's here. I know exactly when in the day that's going to happen. I've got a call at 11. Boom, it's here. I know exactly where that's going to happen. I've got mass at 5:30. Maybe you have other things, you know, but those are the posts that you've got. You know exactly when they're going to happen. You know exactly what time they're going to happen. And then you can take all of the good things that Josemaria was talking about, and you can say, okay, I'm going to do morning prayer before man morning. I'm going to read scripture for a while after, for 20 minutes or whatever, before the 11 o'clock call. You see what I mean? Like you just say sometime in this gap right here. But then notice you're not just saying sometime today. You're already making it more specific, but more specific in a pretty clear way. You're not saying at 10:05 I'm going to do it. Just in this gap. I'm going to do this for this amount of time in this gap. That lets you know pretty quickly if you're falling behind in the day. That's one of the things that's important. People regularly say, I cannot find time for prayer. And that's true. You really have to make time for prayer. If you're just hoping to have a 20 or 30 or hour-long gap in the middle of the day, they just aren't doing anything, I think you've not noticed the way your day works, right? It usually doesn't go like that. I don't know if anyone knows what this is. This is the play that won the Super Bowl. When the Chiefs were down, it was third and I think it was third and long. I think it was third
15.
Yeah, third and 15. Thanks. And Patrick Mahomes goes over and says, "Can we execute Wasp?" Now, this is the root. You'll notice there's some specificity built in. There's also some flexibility built in. You'll see the two arrows there. Obviously, the guy's not going to run both those routes. You're able to kind of adjust it. You know, so it's not going to work for the quarterback to say, hey, I think some of you guys should run down the field and I'll try to throw to whoever's open. That's not a plan, right? But you also have to recognize some flexibility is needed because you don't really know what the other guys are going to do. Well, your life is like this too, right? You don't know what everybody around you is going to do. And so you don't know what your coworkers are going to do. You don't know what your family's going to do. You don't know what the strangers who maybe just cross your path in the middle of the day are going to do. You don't know what the guys in traffic are going to do. You need to have the ability to kind of adjust. You have the general plan with the flexibility built in. That's the idea. And then you can make amazing things happen. Okay. We're getting a little late, but I want to give a few kind of closing thoughts. First one is, this is the time to focus on this. Like, there's a reason we're talking about this right now, and it's this. Some of us really struggled over the time of shutdown. We got lax scenarios where we shouldn't have. So this is a good time to revisit those spots, make some changes, and go stronger. Others of us actually grew during this time. Like, there were things in our life that were just garbage that was getting in the way, and we were forced to detach from it. And we built better habits. We built better routines. We spent more time in prayer. We had fewer distractions. So I say, think of this as akin to the end of a long Lent. Because in Lent, I know I've had this experience, maybe you'll relate to this. I have this thing where I think, I can't give that up. Well, I'm going to try to give it up for Lent, and then it's hard, but by the end of Lent, I'm like, wow, that's actually easier than I thought it was going to be. And I've really grown spiritually by leaps and bounds. And then 2 weeks later, I'm back to it. And it's like, why in the world did you go back to that thing that you saw you didn't need, you could live without, and you were better without? Well, this is where we're at right now. We have been forced to cut off from a lot of things, and some of the things that we were forced to cut off from, it's a good thing, right? Like, we didn't need them, they weren't helping us, and we're better for them being gone. This would be a great time to figure out what those things are, so we don't just unthinkingly go back to them and try to build our old routine again, right? Like, this is the time to make a better plan of life, because we're at a really unique kind of moment. Like, never in life have we had an unintended, an unasked for 2-month forced Lent, right? Like, this is really something. Okay, so some final words of encouragement. St. John Paul II, whose 100th birthday was yesterday, said that since baptism is a true entry into the holiness of God, well, through incorporation into Christ and the indwelling of his Spirit, it would be a contradiction to settle for a life of mediocrity, marked by a minimalist ethic and a shallow religiosity. To ask catechumens, do you wish to receive baptism, means to ask them, do you wish to become holy? We aren't called to mediocrity. You didn't come here to be mediocre. You're not giving up 6:45 to 8 o'clock to be mediocre, right? Like, we want greatness. We're called to greatness. God wants us to be great. And the whole idea of a plan of life is, let's say yes to that call. So again, you never find time for God. Make it. It's who you're made to be. It's why you're baptized. It's why you're here. All right. So that's the last thing in terms of slides, other than small group questions. I want to give time for small groups. So if nobody has questions, we'll break into small groups. But if anyone has anything that's like a burning question you really want to ask, this would be the time to do it. I put a little pressure there, I know.
Hey, Joe, this is Tom Rakunas. Yeah. Not to ask, but just to thank you, since this is our last session. Grateful for all of your good words, all of your instruction, all of your time, all of your effort. It's just been a great source of opportunity and hopefully growth for me. And so I just wanted to thank you before we started group, because I know it kind of cuts off.
True.
So, thank you. God bless you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks. I appreciate that. It's a mutual benefit. I was noticing I was a little more deliberate about having a plan of life today, because I knew I would be a hypocrite otherwise.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mike, what were you going to say?
You can leave me out of the group because I have to leave. I have to go pick somebody up, so I'm going to have to cut out. So anyway, so you can drop me from the group.
Okay. Gentlemen, it's been great. Take a look at these two questions. The first one's basically, remember that 3-part chart earlier, where some of us avoid the good through sluggishness, some of us struggle against it through spite and malice, some of us distract ourselves through keeping ourselves busy or restless or listless. It's possible you struggle with all three, but just say, like, what's my chief area? And then second, have you done a public life? And if so, what's that look like? Has it worked for you? If not, why? If so, what works? You know, like, basically, be great to have a few minutes just to talk about your own experience, maybe encourage other guys. Okay, with that, let's close in a prayer together, and we'll break into small groups for about 10 minutes, and then that'll be it. In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now,
And
and ever shall be,
World without end.
Amen.
And then the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.